Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to see all of you out there and especially to welcome my guest today, Dr. Ali Atkison, who is the founder of ROI Communication Solutions. Dr. Ali, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. It's good to see you again.
Yes, likewise. And we want to give everybody out there a chance to join us this morning. It is 11 o'clock here on the East Coast, and this is an interesting topic that we're going to talk about today. We're going to dive into brain science and communication. And I feel like lots of people are talking about brain this and brain that and eat this and don't do that. And how do you make your brain work and turn on? And mine's a little foggy because I've got a cold this morning, but we're going to peer through that fog. And for those who are joining us little by little, would love to have you share in the chat where you're from and what is your interest in brain science. Why on earth would you take some time out of your otherwise busy day to look at the brain of all things? And we're not going to go into necessarily the active biology of a brain. I don't know, maybe we will. We'll see. But I think we're looking at what it is that we don't even realize is happening in there that makes the difference, in my world at least, between what makes speech go in one ear and come out the other versus go in and stick. And that's, I think, the biggest frustration for a lot of people thinking, why don't you hear what I'm saying? Why aren't you listening? How'd you get that from what I said? How did you, all those confusions, what creates the gap between what I think I say and what you think you hear? And when we can start to reverse engineer that gap, then we go, oh, that's interesting. Okay, so how do I then close that gap? And what strategies, what tactics can I use to make sure that whatever I'm delivering, whatever I'm trying to express to you, goes in and sticks to help make you go, oh, right. I got that. That makes sense. I mean, isn't that the answer that we all want?
I love that. I absolutely love that you said that, because I do think that sometimes people think that it's a mystery, right? And it's a mystery. It's an unsolvable mystery. Well, who knows? There's no solution to that, but there is, and there are strategies that you can use to ensure that when you can communicate with other people, your message really does land and stick.
Yes. Yes. So, and we got already some people who are chiming in on the chat, and you've got your first fan here, Dr. Ali, who says you're a brilliant communications trainer. Glad to see you featured here today. So thank you, Amy, for joining us. We've got Layla coming in from Philadelphia. Yes. Understanding how we communicate, how we connect with people. And Ali, Dr. Ali, that's what you and I were talking about before we even went live, that it's not just about public speaking or about presentation skills. It's about connecting with people, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The heart of my work really is about connection, especially in this day and age when we are so inundated with, there's a phrase that Stephen Pacinelli coined called digital pollution, right? And it's just, we're just bombarded all the time with so much. And so we lose that human connection with one another when we're communicating, whether we're talking in person or digitally, which that's how most of us communicate nowadays. So it's more important than ever nowadays to really make sure that when we communicate with other people, we are breaking through that digital pollution and not being digital polluters ourselves. And instead we're using, really effective communication to cut straight through all that pollution and really connect with the other person. So the things that we'll talk about today, Dr. Laura, I know we talked about it, are, yes, can apply to public speaking, presentations, whether you're doing that to a large group or two people, but it really just applies for the most part to everyday communication. And that's the cool thing.
Absolutely. And I always say that the definition for me of public speaking is anytime you're talking to someone besides yourself.
Yeah.
And again, sometimes that's the best conversation you're going to have all day is when you're talking to yourself. I find I do it quite often, but that notwithstanding, that's not public. If it's just you and me, that's public. If there's 1,000 people on this call, that's public. If it's digital, if it's on stage, if it's in front of a boardroom, in front of a classroom, or just sitting across the table with someone, that's public speaking. The idea is you have an idea that you want to convey. You want to get them to yes. You're public speaking, right? Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about your background. What is your background and I know you've got 3 degrees in communications. So where does brain science come into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was in the academic world for 20 years. I was a communications professor and associate dean for a college for continuing and professional studies. So I did get my doctorate in human communication studies. way back in the day, about 150 years ago, when I got accepted to graduate school, I got accepted with an assistantship, which meant that my tuition was covered in exchange for teaching. And actually, I had no designs on teaching. That wasn't why I had applied to go to grad school. But, as I like to say, if they told me that my tuition was covered, if they had asked me to clean the pool, I would have said yes. I was like,
Yes.
absolutely, I'll teach then. But really, unfortunately, I was never taught how to be a good teacher. I was pretty much handed my book and, showed me the classroom, and then poof, I was a teacher. And I was barely older than the students I was teaching. So I was pretty terrified. And the first couple of years did not go well. It was really, me reading the book to them that I had asked them to already read. And I didn't like that. I didn't like doing this job that I didn't feel like I was doing it well. And so I just decided pretty early on that if I was going to be a teacher, I wanted to ensure that my students were actually learning. And it goes back to what we were just saying. I wanted to make sure that I was actually connecting with them. And I could tell that was not happening. Like I was this separate talking head up there, and I lost them every day. So I started researching better teaching practice, which in short order led me to researching how the brain learns. And, like I said, this was many years ago now, so it wasn't as pervasive as it is now. There are a lot of people interested in brain science now, which I think is great because we have so much yet to learn. But back then it was fairly novel. And so I started just sharing what I was learning with other teachers. And then over time, that led me to doing some consulting work. I started sharing these same exact tips with trainers because, again, it's just a different type of classroom, right? And then one day I had this epiphany of, gosh, I don't know now, 10, 15 years ago, I've lost all sense of time, but that, these same concepts that I was using to teach teachers and trainers how to be better teachers and trainers, I go, I can meld these with my communications expertise, and really the same concepts apply to everyday communication because, again, it's all about connecting with other people. So that's really what I've been doing since then. Is I, mostly do professional speaking. I do some small group training as well on just helping people use these very simple. Yes, they're grounded in brain science, but the fun part is that they're actually super simple to apply tips for connecting better with other people.
Yes, yes. And that's what we're going to dive into in a little while. So everybody who's there, put any questions that you have for me or for Dr. Ali, feel free to put those questions in the chat as well. We definitely want to know what's the burning desires that you have as far as how we can help you be better communicators. And for that matter, who you are trying to communicate with. I see we've got some people here from different universities, Temple University in Philadelphia. We've got people who are in the professional world, people who are in academia, people, and teaching is something that we all have to do. And it's important, I think, to realize that teaching and learning are two sides of the same coin, but they're not identical, right? You can teach your information, as you were mentioning before. Okay, well, I can read from the textbook. Does that count as teaching? Sure. Does that mean the students will have learned it? Not necessarily. And my students or audience or whoever you're speaking to, for me, my background, I was an educator, I was a teacher. So that is the part that I was strong in the beginning. But I did my master's degree in education, and then my PhD was in linguistics and education. And it was really looking at the speech aspect and looking at what it is in many ways about the voice, what it is about the way things are framed and structured. We'll talk about scaffolding and prior knowledge tapping and those kinds of things later on as well. But what is it about little nuances of the voice and the way we deliver our message that does influence whether it goes in sticks or in one ear and out the other, or just over their head completely? You can pick whatever metaphor you want in those areas. But one of the things that I found, because I did, like you, I had a teaching fellowship, but much of my teaching was training teachers because that was already my background. So I was at the Graduate School of Education, and for the fieldwork course that I was teaching, many of my teachers, my students were then teaching somewhere else, elementary schools or wherever in the city, and I would go to visit them in their site and watch them teach. And one of the most prevalent habits and unsuccessful practices that I saw there is exactly the same as what I now see with clients in the corporate world who are trying to give presentations, which is the idea of, well, I put so much time and effort into preparing my lesson plan. I put so much time and effort into preparing my slides and my deck and all the information that I want to teach. And then their priority becomes, okay, oh my gosh, I only have 20 minutes left. I'm going to run out of time, but I still have 2/3 of my lesson plan. I still have 3/4 of my deck that I haven't. So you go into motor mouth mode and you blow through the information so fast that you feel successful because check, you finished teaching, you finished the presentation, but did anything get through? No. Did they learn anything? Unlikely. Were you persuasive? Unlikely. Regardless, again, classroom or boardroom, doesn't matter. It's the same challenge. So great, we got some people coming in now from Indianapolis. So we're stretching out. That's your home state, yes? Or okay.
Indies representing. I love it.
What's that?
I said Indies representing. I love it.
Yes, we got people from all over the place. This is super exciting. So tell me a little bit, Dr. Ali, when you think about teaching and learning, how the brain learns all of this, what's one of the major tips that you can share with us that are simple tips about how to be more influential, how to be more effective as a communicator? And I'm going to use, from now on, we're going to use the words teaching and presenting interchangeably unless otherwise specified, because I want people out there to realize that you have to think of yourself as a teacher when you are explaining, and your audience should be learning, because if they're not learning from you, then you're not persuading them. You're not having influence, other than possibly influence to do the exact opposite of what you're suggesting. So give us an example of a brain-based tip that we can use.
Absolutely. So all of my tips really are grounded in one really, really important thing to understand, and that is the importance of connecting to another person's prior knowledge. If you can't do that, if you don't do that, then you will not connect with them. There's a wonderful book written by a professor named James Zoll called The Art of Changing the Brain. And in it, he has a quote that I absolutely love because it boils it all down really simply. No one can understand anything if it isn't connected in some way to something they already know. And I love that. And the way he explains it is that it is a physical state of our brain, right? So, and I know, Dr. Laura, I'll be telling you things you already know, so bear with me.
Oh, we're sharing it with everybody. That's the whole point of the discussion.
So our brain is comprised of about 100 billion neurons. Now, scientists debate this number, but each neuron has basically these little, they're like little finger-like structures, right? Little axons and dendrites. And what happens is that each time we learn something new, basically a new neuronal network is formed in our brain. So a new teeny tiny little branch forms off of an existing neuron. And it's a physical thing in our brain. In other words, the knowledge in our brain is physical. It's not a concept, right? It's not ephemeral. It doesn't bounce around or live only as an idea. It's actually a physical structure in our brain. And so you can think of our brain as, I always imagine it like if you've ever seen an Amazon warehouse, or even if you haven't, you could probably imagine it, right? So think of your brain as comprised of like 1 trillion teeny tiny little cubbies. And so every time we encounter new information, new data, our brain will immediately start scanning all of these cubbies to say, okay, how is this new information like something I already know? And it will lock on to the thing that it thinks is the closest connection. Now, when I'm communicating with you, it may not be the connection I am hoping you make, right? I can't necessarily control the connection you make. You go, oh, your brain says, oh, this is like that thing. Now I might go, well, no, not exactly. But that's okay, because any connection is better than no connection. Yes. So when we make a connection with another person, then we're connecting somehow to their prior knowledge. One of the kind of simple ways that I like to talk about it is we so often as communicators think, and it's exactly what you were talking about with the presentation, where I've got all this great information, I'm just going to throw it at you, right? We make the mistake of thinking that that's all we have to do. You know, well, I gave it to you, I said it to you, so now it's your turn, right? Well, actually, the onus is on us as the communicator to ensure that we are connecting with that prior knowledge. So how do we do that? That's really where the tips come in. So I'll start with one of my most favorite, because I think it's the easiest one.
Awesome. And before you go in, so I'm going to put a little suspenseful pause in
Yes.
there. That whole notion of tapping prior knowledge in the education world, that's what's often referred to as scaffolding.
Yes.
So whether you're using you mentioned the axons and the dendrites and all the little fingers, then they create this neural network. There's if you are a visual learner, you may want to think about it like a cargo net. There's all the chain link fences. There's all these connections that start to come. The scaffolding notion, if you think about when a building is going up and the construction workers have all the scaffolding on the outside, and you start with the bottom level, and there's a bunch of poles and some platforms and whatnot and crisscrossed beams of sorts. But then it's not until you have the lower one, then you build the next one on top of it, and you build the next one on top of it, and the next one on top of it. So that's the idea of the scaffolding reference to tapping prior knowledge. You have to go to what's already in the foundation of the person's understanding and knowledge, and then you can add on top of that and create that scaffold. So just for what that's worth. All right, go ahead, Dr. Ali, give us your first tip.
I love that, because actually you just illustrated my first tip. And the first tip is to use analogies. Analogies are such a great way to connect to another person's prior knowledge, because here's the thing. So when I tell people, okay, you have to figure out what's already in a person's brain and tap into that somehow. Oh my gosh, that sounds really daunting. Like, how the heck? I don't even know what's in my own brain half the time. I walk into a room and go, why am I here?
Yes.
So how am I supposed to know?
Is there a way to fix that? Oh my gosh, we can make $1 million on this recording if we can figure out it. Is there? Okay.
To fix it. You have to go back to where you were when you thought about doing the thing you walked into the next room to do.
Okay.
Yep, because our brain is very contextual. Memories are related to the context in which the memory happened. And so you're more likely to remember what you went in the other room to do if you go back to the room where you thought about doing the thing. So that's a simple tip for that one. Yep.
There we go. That explains why when I go from the kitchen to the pantry, I walk in and I go, why am I here? Then you go back and you start to try to make the recipe again, and you go, oh, right. Because I don't have the salt. I have to go back and get the salt. Duh. But in between those 20 paces between the counter and the pantry, suddenly it just evaporates.
It's
scary. Okay. So go ahead, tell us about analogies.
Salt. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Which is also another tip. So analogies are a wonderful way to connect to another person's prior experience or prior knowledge. And, kind of like you said about presenting and teaching, prior experience, prior knowledge, potato to some extent. So analogies are great ways to do that, because analogies basically allow us to use language that is most likely more familiar to the other person. And so you're going to be more likely to connect to something that they already know and understand. And it's a great way to explain what you're thinking, right? So I'll give you an example. Well, the analogy you just used of the cargo net to talk about the whole neuronal network, right? Our whole system of neurons in our brain. You can imagine a big cargo net. That's a great analogy, because most people know what even if you've never seen a picture of a neuronal network, you probably have seen a cargo net. So you can go, oh, okay, that makes sense to me. So I don't have to explain the chemistry, the biology, the mechanics, all of the, the real neuroscience that explains what a neuronal network is. But I can just say it's like a cargo net, and you go, totally understand.
Yeah.
So, so I've got a couple of others that I'll share. Some of my favorites over the course of the years. Well, I used to teach a class in conflict management. And, you can define conflict for somebody, but that's not very useful. It's not very helpful, right? Like, what is conflict? And so I always found that a better way to understand what my students thought conflict was, and what they kind of how they approach conflict was, I would ask them to create a metaphor or a simile about conflict. And so one of the favorite ones that one of my students came up with one time is, she said, I think conflict is like two bald men fighting over a comb. I love that, because right away, she doesn't have to give me some textbook definition of conflict. I immediately get a sense that she finds conflict rather pointless. right? And so using that analogy allows me to connect to her experience of conflict really quickly and easily without her having to explain why she finds it pointless or getting into things that are difficult for her to talk about, things like that. Like right away, I understand where she's coming from. So that's what analogies do, is they really allow us to connect to other people more quickly and make it more likely that we're connecting to something that they understand.
Yes. And I love that analogy about the comb. I think I'm going to have to use that at some point. That's
Great.
that's a perfect. And you know what is also valuable in that one is because it's funny and it makes you laugh. That creates all those happy hormones that start to fire off. And when you're feeling those dopamine and whatever other receptors, that makes you that whatever you learned or whatever you heard in that moment that created that happy feeling is going to stick better, which is
Absolutely.
where humor can be a really valuable tool. And it's not to say that you should try to pretend to be a stand-up comic, or if you know you're not inherently funny, don't try to throw in a knock knock joke just for the sake of
Yeah,
something perfunctory. But to the extent that a little bit of humor can be infused into anything, anywhere, it makes the point stick. It's funny how
absolutely.
that works.
Absolutely. Well, interestingly, any emotion is more likely to make something stick. So humor
Right.
is one thing, right? But tapping any emotion is actually, again, a great way. Now we're really talking about creating memories more so than necessarily connecting with another person, although
Sure.
they're, two sides of the same coin to some extent. But yeah, using emotion, tapping into emotion is great. So, think of advertising. Advertising wouldn't be $1 billion industry if it didn't work to tap into people's emotions. So, they typically tap into, fear, sadness, anger, of course, humor or happiness. I think I'm forgetting a couple, but those are some things that we can also do. And the reason it works, you said it's interesting, and it is. And the reason it works is that our memories are, I think I mentioned this a second ago, but they're very contextual. And when something is related to emotion, when we had a heightened sense of any emotion while something happened, we are more likely to remember that thing. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't have this part memorized, but essentially the same parts of the brain that form memories are associated with feeling emotions. And that's why, so they're both basically lit up at the exact same time.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's really great. So, again, as a communicator, if you can figure out a way to, now does that mean that, you should be angry when you communicate? No, I don't recommend that. but sometimes, again, going back to an analogy or asking people questions, we'll get to, I know, Dr. Laura, you and I talked about inquiry is my favorite tool. But asking questions about, do you remember a time you were really angry? And then if a person says, well, yes, my teenage daughter did this thing that just drove me insane. And maybe then you can go, okay, that's great. Well, maybe not great in the moment, but that's helpful for me to understand where you're coming from. What I'm talking about is very similar to what you experienced in that moment. And here's how. So, again, anytime that we can kind of connect to people's emotions that way, we are more likely to connect to them, to make a connection to something that we're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then if there's any questions, again, to everybody else out there who is tuning into us, whether you're on LinkedIn or on YouTube, by all means, feel free to comment. You can say something like that you are particularly curious about something, or that it reminds you of a time for you. If we are triggering some networking for you, some past memories or some experiences, share those with us, because we want to know not just what your questions are, but if something sticks. And isn't that what we're talking about? How to make something stick. So we want to know what's sticking for you, or what's perhaps making other memories, it's conjuring other memories, or helping you to make other associations. So share your thoughts with us, share your challenges with us, share your questions with us, and with each other for that matter. This is not middle school where like passing notes is not allowed and you have to just be quiet while the teacher talks. We want you guys to participate. So please let us know whatever's going through your mind at the moment as we talk about the mind and the brain. All right, Dr. Alley, tell us number 2. You mentioned one just a moment ago.
Yes, one of my other favorite tools is inquiry. And I know that sounds kind of academic. So really it's just a fancy way of saying ask questions, ask more questions. Again, how can I know what is in another person's head? What is their prior knowledge? I can ask questions. In all honesty, sometimes it is as simple as I'll use my friend Amy because I know she's on the call. Amy, what's been your experience with this thing? Or what do you already know about this? Or what do you think about it? But what's been your experience with is a great inquiry prompt, because it leaves my opinion out of it altogether, right? And it doesn't necessarily ask for their opinion either, but their experience with something. So you're not necessarily putting them in the hot seat if they want to say, well, actually, I don't like it. But they could say, well, gosh, I actually kind of had a negative experience. Or when I was little, this happened. So asking somebody, what's your experience with something, is a great, great, great kind of universal inquiry prompt to just try to understand what is their prior knowledge. And then, you may not get an immediate connection with one question, but the more questions you can ask, the more likely you are to be able to understand where that person is coming from. And again, the onus is on us as the communicator to meet them where they are, not to expect them to come to where we are, right?
Right.
So really, frankly, it's a fairly empathetic approach to communication. I tend to focus more on skills than on mindset in the communication tactics that I teach. But yes, it is an empathetic approach, and that's also amazing. So it's going to help you build stronger relationships, to quote Dale Carnegie, win friends and influence people, when you ask a lot of questions, because you become naturally inquisitive and interested in other people.
It's funny because when I'm running a training or just speaking at whatever stage, or even virtually for that matter, I'll often start with a bunch of questions just to get the audience's mind going, and also to see how many hands go up. And because I realize that those questions are things that will help them tap into their own brain and go, where is this relevant in my life from the beginning? So then they're primed. We talk about priming as an important structure for awareness and for cognition. They become primed and ready to receive more information. So I may start a program with 3 or 4 questions, and you can feel free to chime in with a yes or me or something in the chat if this resonates with you, but something like, how many of you have had an experience where you hear yourself say something and then you think, that sounded better in my head? Anybody ever have one of those experiences? Or maybe you're having a conversation with somebody and then they get all angry and you go, why are you mad? What did I say? And they say, well, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Sound familiar? Anyone? Or it may be a matter of, have you had those situations where you're having a little bit of a heated conversation with somebody and they respond to something you said and you go, how did you get that from what I said? How did you put those pieces? And all these kinds of things tend to, every day, Peter says. So these are really common experiences. And I'll bet that, as I mentioned, at least 1 or 2 of these, if not all 3, you could immediately go to the person or the scenario that you most recently had, or one of the most emotionally powerful experiences you had, because either that sounded better in my head piece could evoke a feeling of shame or embarrassment, and the or frustration in the other situations. When you make those initial connections, you're suddenly going, oh yes, didn't like that, or did like it, or whatever the question evokes. And then you're emotionally primed. You're already thinking about, okay, that's the problem she's going to help me solve, or at least reduce. And you're seeking the answers. And when a brain is seeking information, it's much more likely to receive it, as opposed to when something just comes out of left field. So all these, those kinds of, the notion of inquiry, as you phrased it, it sounds very official that way, but it really is just asking questions. And the better the questions you ask, the better the answers you're going to get.
Absolutely. One of the things that you just said, Dr. Laura, reminded me of one of my favorite concepts called a curiosity vortex. I don't know if you've heard of this.
I watched the TED Talk you recommended to me, which was really interesting. So if you want to share about that, but I love that phrase. So everybody write this down. You make you sound real smart later on. A curiosity vortex. I just learned that one a couple of days ago also. Tell us about the curiosity vortex.
This is one of my favorite concepts. So it's related to inquiry. I'm going to take a step back before I get into this concept. I've been at a couple of talks in the last couple of years where I've heard people say something incorrect, which is, when you're asked a question, your brain is incapable of doing anything other than trying to answer that question. That's not true. That's an oversimplification of what happens in our brain. Now, what is true, however, is that if you ask a person a good question, right, that does engage them, as the ones that Dr. Laura just gave are great examples, then you are more likely to pique their curiosity. When you pique a person's curiosity, literally like a whole world opens up in their brain. You create a curiosity vortex. And the reason is that, again, I'm not going to remember the exact terminology in the brain, but essentially the reason is that the same areas of the brain that are responsible for anticipating rewards are the same areas of the brain that kind of light up when we're curious about something. So when we're curious about something, we're anticipating a reward. The same as like when we think, ooh, am I going to get that bonus? Am I going to get that raise? Or is my pizza almost here? I mean, literally any kind of like anticipation. It's the same area when we're curious. And so what's really, really cool about the curiosity vortex is that if you pique a person's curiosity with a good question, it could be, a question that, kind of immediately involves them. Like, here are some things I want you to kind of think about today. It could, by the way, even be random trivia, as long as it's really interesting. Then you open that curiosity vortex. And what happens is that the person on the receiving end, or people, are more likely to not only remember what you've said, learn what you've said, be interested in what you've said, even if it actually even if you talk about things during the sort of vortex that aren't even necessarily your main point, they're more likely to remember everything that sort of occurs during that vortex. Now, one thing we don't know is, what's the window of this vortex? Like, okay, once I open the vortex, do I have 30 seconds, 30 minutes? That is dependent to some extent on the person, because now I'm really going down a rabbit hole here. I warned you I would do this.
No problem. Go. Find the rabbit.
The whole notion of an attention span is a myth. Attention is selective, period. If you keep a person's attention, then you have their attention. It's not like, oh no, it's been 12 seconds, I'm going to lose them. That's not true. That's a myth. And by the way, it's also a myth that goldfish have a short attention span. They're actually quite capable of learning. I've heard that as an analogy a lot, like, oh, we have the average attention span of a goldfish. It's like, actually, goldfish have the same attention span we do if they're interested in something. I thought that was really interesting.
Hilarious. Okay, so note to self: somebody tells you have the attention span of a goldfish. That's actually a compliment. Who
Could
knew?
be a compliment, yes. So attention is selective, and that's the bottom line. If a person is interested and motivated to select, to pay attention to what's happening in front of them, then they can do it. I mean, think about it. If you watch a movie, you can pay attention for 90 minutes, presumably, unless you're distracted by your phone. But that just means that your phone is more interesting to you than the movie. It doesn't mean that you're incapable of paying attention to the movie.
Right.
So there certainly are more things nowadays that compete for our attention. And yes, we do tend to engage in task switching, more often than we probably should. But
I like the way you use that phrase in there. I heard that, this task switching. Did everybody notice that? Not multitasking, but task switching. You want to explain the distinction? I caught that. So you want to explain why you use that phrase, task switching?
Yes. So we tend to say, some people actually claim to be good multitaskers, and some people admit that they're not. But the truth is, no one is a good multitasker, because it's impossible. Our brain is simply not capable of attending to attention-rich stimuli at the same time. Now, notice I said attention-rich. So the distinction is, can I be talking to Dr. Laura and could I be doodling at the same time, or tapping my foot, or twirling my hair? Yeah, I can do all of those things, because those second things aren't attention-rich stimuli. But what I cannot do successfully is talk to Dr. Laura and type something, right? I could type, I can engage in the act of typing, but I guarantee you it's going to be gobbledygook when I go back to look at what I've typed. So our brain is just not capable of it. There is some new research that is pretty interesting in terms of what happens to us when we attempt to multitask. And that is that our brain actually releases cortisol and epinephrine, which create, of course, that's what puts our brain into the fight or flight mode. It creates a sense of distrust. And get this, our IQ actually decreases during the moment we are multitasking. So you literally get
That
done.
explains a lot.
Yeah. So multitasking, just really try to avoid it. The truth is that you think you're doing it, but what happens is that you're not doing either thing well, and you're not, giving either thing the justice that it probably deserves.
Yes, and somebody in the chat just shared, Dr. Ali, so glad to hear you busting this myth called multitasking. Bigfoot and multitasking are both myths.
Agreed. Yeah. Now there is some research that suggests that we might, as a human species, be getting better at task switching more effectively. Meaning, but all that means is that I can more quickly attend to this task and then switch into attending to another task and do both okay. But again, that's not the same thing as doing them at the same time.
Right. Right. So, and of course, it depends on what we're writing too. Everything is contextually dependent. So if we're having a conversation and I'm writing, am I taking notes on what you're saying, or am I trying to compose an email to somebody else to sort of get it done while we're having the conversation? And that's on a totally separate topic. Of course, so it's not just the notion of the act of writing, but what the topic is, how it's relevant, and does it reinforce perhaps what we're saying, the topic that we're discussing.
Right.
So all great topics. Do you have another one? Any questions out there, by the way? Remember, feel free to ask the questions. We've got some fun comments that are coming in, but questions we're very happy to field as well to the extent that we can. Okay, so Dr. Ali, how about another one?
Sure, absolutely. So I want to go back actually to one of the other things that you said a minute ago, and it'll actually take me back to inquiry and asking good questions. But one of the reasons that I think that this is so important is that you talked about sometimes if you're having like a difficult or challenging conversation with somebody that maybe just isn't going really well. We live in a pretty divisive climate nowadays, right? And political beliefs and beliefs about our health and the environment and all these things. People are pretty divided on these issues nowadays. And sometimes the conversations can get really contentious. And so what happens is that we tend to just avoid them. So one of the very lovely things about learning to ask questions is that what we know from the brain research about this is that it is one of the most effective ways to have a conversation with somebody who has very different beliefs than yours. It's a kind of an unfortunate situation that when a person has really entrenched beliefs, and again, usually political or beliefs about the climate or things like that, they're pretty entrenched. And what entrenched essentially in layperson's terms means is that these beliefs are connected to our identity. So if I'm having a conversation with Dr. Laura and she says something the opposite of what I believe, then I immediately think that she's saying, well, Allie, you're a bad person, stupid, I don't agree with you and your assessment of the world around you, not just, I don't necessarily agree with you on this topic. Like that's kind of how we hear it. So the bottom line is that asking questions when we're having a conversation like that is the most effective way to move the needle with somebody with whom we don't necessarily agree. I will tell you that throwing data and facts at them all day long, never going to move the needle. You've probably tried it. Almost all of us have, right? And you're thinking, how is this not changing this person's mind? I'm throwing facts and facts and facts. It's because once you have threatened their identity, they shut down. That part of the brain that was open before, is now in fight or flight mode. Yes. So they're just not listening. So asking lots of questions. So questions like, I'll pick a random name. So, so Russell, I'm curious, I'm going to go back to the same universal one. What's been your experience with guns? Oh, that's so interesting. So tell me why you think that. Oh, wow. Okay. Now, how long have you felt that way? I mean, just keep asking more and more and more questions. And so what happens is that you open up the door to see each other more as human beings and not as just purveyors of this opinion. Right? Now, are you ever going to move a person from this to this in one conversation by asking great questions? No, you won't. You might move the needle a little bit, but that's further than you're going to get if you just keep throwing facts at them and challenging who they are as people. So asking questions is so, so great for that.
Yes. And I think one of the strongest gravitations that we all have is the need to be consistent with the sense of our own identities. And in what I mean by that is that it's, even if you bring up a point that's maybe contrary to my original belief, it's hard for me to admit that you may be right, or that I can see a distinction or see where you may feel that way. because then it means that I would be wrong. And we're so unwilling to admit that we may be wrong in something. So finding a better way than the I'm right, you're wrong, zero sum kind of a thing. We are going to stick with things that'll allow us to remain consistent, even in our own, if it's only in our own minds. And I think the other piece is that we tend to, um, and I don't have the statistics in front of me, but we tend to make decisions emotionally first on a reflex, this instinctive gut level. I want this. I don't want that. I like this. I don't like that. I trust this. I don't trust that. And then we seek data to reinforce it. So that's also part of the reason why you can't just, throw tons of statistics at somebody, because if they emotionally are really connected to whatever the platform happens to be, whether it's guns or environment or something else, then they're emotionally, that emotional connection means they're only going to seek the or be as receptive to information that reinforces what they already believe. So it's very hard to get them to accept data in the other direction without questioning it. And not that we shouldn't question any statistics that come our way, but what are we more likely to question and what are we more likely to readily accept? Stuff that
Right.
reinforces what we already know and want to believe.
Exactly. Well, and you just said the exact right words, things we already know. It goes back to prior knowledge. Exactly.
Right.
Right. So we make decisions based on emotion because we're connecting information to the things we already know, which are memories, which are usually very emotional, or they wouldn't be memories to begin with because emotion helps imprint memories. So again, so if you're coming at me with like a fact that goes against all of the things that I'm going, wait a minute, I'm searching my, my Amazon lockers full of information. And I'm remembering, what my mom told me, and I'm remembering an experience I had in sixth grade that tells me otherwise. Those are way more powerful for me than your fact. Right. So so again, the fact isn't connecting to something I already know. That's
Right.
just online, and questions help you do that. So yeah, it really is just simplest tool. And again, you're not likely to change their mind, but you are likely to have a better relationship with them. And if you keep doing that over time, then eventually you're going to open the door to more of a collaborative conversation, so that, I would be able to eventually say, well, gosh, Russell, you know what? I had kind of a negative experience one time. I actually had a gun drawn on me and it was really terrifying, and again, not facts, but just sharing my human experience with that thing. And so that's a much more, you're in the long game though. You're in the long game to move the needle on somebody's entrenched beliefs. It's not going to happen in one conversation, most likely.
Well, and I don't think it's on any of those big issues. There's right and wrongs, not right and wrongs. That's not. There's valid experiences and feelings and um, values and beliefs on both sides of any issue. Everybody is whatever is their strongest motivation, their strongest fear, their strongest desire. That's never invalid. It's simply a question of learning to, as you said, see the other person as just that, as a person. And when you can do that, you can what negotiators will call things like expanding the pie. It's not just about, am I going to take yours from you or you're going to take mine from me? Well, what are we really trying to accomplish, and how can we do that and make sure that both of our inherent needs, our need for safety, our need for significance, our need for love, our need for whatever it happens to be, are still met, without taking away somebody else's. There's a good question in the chat. Layla asks, is it also opening them up to more curiosity by asking questions? That she says, I know this is an area that I struggle with when there's a strong difference of opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it absolutely will. The more curious you seem, first of all, they'll be more open to you. And then again, if you're asking questions, now, asking questions, just simply the act of asking questions, as we talked about, is already a wonderful tool. If you can get even more skilled at asking really good questions that do pique their curiosity, but honestly, even sometimes saying to a person, oh, why do you think that? Tell me more about that, right? And not asking it in an accusatory way, but, oh, interesting, what makes you think that? You're really asking them to explain, their own thoughts, et cetera. And yes, they do kind of get curious about their own, like, why do I think this? And it sort of forces them to articulate it. So yeah, absolutely. Just the act of engaging in inquiry is going to make another person more curious. Again, now we go back to selective attention. I can't tell you, you've got 2 minutes. or you've got 12 minutes of their attention. It kind of depends on how the conversation is going, how open you seem, etc. But
Yes.
yeah,
The ability not just to momentarily capture someone's attention, but to sustain it is
right.
an ongoing effort in any sort of public speaking or teaching or et cetera. I often draw the distinction between having a captive audience and a captivated audience. I feel like most audiences are kind of captives, that they'd rather be kind of anywhere else, but they're stuck here
Yeah.
until the time is up. Whereas a captivated audience has the freedom to go anywhere else, but they choose to be here. That's a really important distinction that lets me know, okay, there's something that I'm connecting with cognitively, emotionally. I've opened that curiosity vortex. They're interested in learning more about it
Yep.
because they could. Now, are they multitasking or, task switching? Are they checking their phones while listening to this conversation? There's lots of things people could be doing, but there's still enough of an attention span that they're choosing to be here. Is your audience choosing to be there and listening to you?
I love that. I absolutely love that. Yeah.
And I think too many audiences are captives, more especially in classrooms or in board meetings or in whatever else. No, I don't know anybody who looks at their calendar for the day and sees 17 meetings and goes, "Oh, good."
Yeah. So true. So true. Yeah.
Right.
And this is a great segue. Do we have time to do one more tip? Do you
Yeah,
think?
please. Absolutely.
A great segue to the other one that I really wanted to get to today, because you talked about, keeping them captivated. Okay, one of the best ways to do that is, now I'm using a teaching term. I'll start out with the teaching term, which is creating what we call an enriched environment. Long story short, what that really means is using multiple types of stimuli when you communicate to another person. And this is important because we know that our brain processes things in a multimodal fashion. So there's a famous professor named Robert Sylvester who likened it to a jazz quartet. So where, the jazz seems kind of discordant and you've got all these rather random notes, right? But it ultimately comes together to produce a congruent sound. I mean, that kind of depends. If you don't like jazz, you might not agree with that. But
I love jazz. I totally get it.
It's an analogy anyway. And so our brain is much the same way. Lots of different types of stimuli layered on top of each other helps us produce a more robust understanding of that thing rather than just one thing. So people often use the phrase, for example, like, I'm a visual learner. And it's like, well, actually, everybody's a visual. If you can see, you're a visual learner. But what they mean by that is, I need to not only read something, but I also need to see it done, or I need to talk it through, or whatever. I'm an experiential learner. They really are part and parcel of the same thing, because everybody is, because that's how our brain works. We need multiple modes of stimuli in order to develop the most robust picture of something. And so this is fairly easy to get across the concept for teachers, right? So of course, if I'm teaching conservation, and I'm going to show a picture of a, humpback whale, and I'm going to play the sound of the humpback whale so they can hear what one sounds like. And then I'm going to say, remember the last time you ate a hard-boiled egg? That's what a whale's skin feels like. It feels like a hard-boiled egg. And then I'm going to say a baby humpback whale gains 9 pounds an hour, which is amazing, because you think, we all
I think I can usually do that on Christmas. That's something.
for sure.
It's not too hard.
Saturday, but yeah, if we all gain weight at that rate, we would weigh 200, and I think it's 218 more pounds by this time tomorrow. So that's amazing, right? Okay, but that's if I'm teaching. What about in everyday life? How do you take this concept of creating an enriched environment in everyday life? It's so easy, especially people think like, well, I can't do that in digital communication, but you absolutely can. I'm going to give you one of my favorite examples.
Please do.
So I don't think my mom is here today, so she won't mind that I'm making fun of myself by way of her, but she likes to refer to me as what we call directionally challenged. I am not good with directions at all.
The GPS is definitely your friend.
Thank goodness for Waze. I can't be without it. But I have a friend here in Indy who I've met recently in Indianapolis, where I live. And she's really great because she understands that I'm directionally challenged. And on top of that, I don't know Indianapolis very well. So she'll send me the address and I'll plug it into Waze. But here's the other thing she always does. She sends me a picture, from a Google image of the place where we're meeting. So that not only when Waze says, I mean, you've used Waze or Google Maps and it says, you have arrived, and you're going, I have, I don't know, which building is it, right? So she sends me a picture of the building. So I recognize it immediately once I'm there, and I can go, oh, there it is. so thoughtful. And unbeknownst to her, she's creating an enriched environment for me. She's not only giving me
Interesting.
the physical address, but she's showing me what the building looks like. So it's such a simple tip, a little thing that we can do. Another one is when you email somebody, if rather than saying something like, hey, remember we talked about blah, 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 a couple of weeks ago, try to find the email exchange you had about that thing and forward that and say, hey, I'm referring to the below email exchange in case you need a refresher, and I have a follow-up. Right. So that way, you save them time, because now they don't have to go searching for it themselves when they're like, wait, okay, so clearly Allie remembers this conversation, but I don't.
Right.
I don't assume the other person remembers the same thing you do. In fact, they probably don't, and they might remember it differently. So, just the simple act of forwarding a previous conversation to say, hey, as a reminder, or I've got to follow up, and make it easy for them. So those are just simple little tips and ways that we can create enriched environments every day. Sending people videos and pictures, in addition to just words. That's one of the real advantages of having a smartphone nowadays. So
Yes. That's terrific. And how can that work if we're doing presentations at work or something a little bit more formal? What kind of enriched environment would we use?
that's a great question. Yeah. So I think that there is sometimes, granted, this could come down to organizational culture, but I would recommend that try to use, again, multiple types of stimuli. So don't just rely on a slide deck as your only means of conveying information. Although, admittedly, a slide deck in and of itself is already another type of stimuli, right? In addition to just me talking, so that's good. But the more you can layer even on top of that. So make sure your slides are clear and concise and not full of too much for people to
Not
look
the
at.
New York Times in a slide.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, different rabbit hole. But if you can add a video into your presentation, people love videos, and they're excellent ways, to convey information other than just you.
Yes.
The other thing you can do, and this sounds like a simple, again, silly little thing, but use your body. I mean, sometimes when we present, we tend to just stand there, or even if we're sitting, but literally the act of moving means I now have your attention again, right? So I used to have kind of a funny little trick I did when I taught, and if I thought I was kind of losing the class, I would just very simply, I don't want to do it now because I'll probably make something fall off my desk, but I would kind of softly, but like kind of, slap the desk and go, okay, everybody, here's what we're going to do. And even little things like that, like, oh, all of a sudden, I'm selecting to pay attention to you again because you've given me the choice, right? So little tricks like that, but using your body, if you're giving a presentation and the room is small enough, stand up. Don't pace where you look like a caged lion.
Right.
Move around a little bit. Those are simple little things. If you can bring visual aids, right, to help your presentation. Remember back when we were kids doing show and tell? I mean, It's called show and tell, not tell and tell. It's called show and tell, right?
Right.
Doing a presentation as an adult shouldn't be any different. So if there's something that you can physically bring to help people make sense of something, or again, even to use an analogy. So if you want to say, I'm going to find the lamest thing I have around, but let's say I was just comparing something to a smartphone. Don't make people imagine a smartphone. Hold one up and say, it's just like your smartphone. And it's even simple little things like that. Again, it helps get them reconnected with you, and it helps make sure that they understand what it is you're talking about.
Yes, yes. And body language is a funny thing because I get asked questions about body language all the time. How much should we move? If I'm standing or if I'm sitting or if we're on virtual, or should we move at all or not enough? And I feel like there's so many elements to consider there. It always depends, the how much is directly relative to the nature of the situation. But the analogy that I like to use, and here's your analogy, is that we want to win an Oscar for our performance, not look like one.
Yeah.
So it's not enough. You don't want to just be so totally stiff that nothing's moving but your lips and possibly your eyes. And usually it's your eyes when they're looking up at the ceiling because you're thinking, what's my answer? We need to have a little bit more motion than that. And when you think about it, what is one of the biggest frustrations that people have in the virtual world, especially when others have their cameras off? I can't read the other person. I don't have any body language to read off of. So I don't have any cues to sense what they're feeling. Or maybe I just have like the giant face,
Right.
as most of us show up, and I still can't read their body language. So to be able to back off a little bit, I see you're pushed back a little bit further too. I like to be able to be visible from at least kind of mid torso on up, because
Yeah.
that gives you more to read. It allows you to see where I'm moving, if I'm leaning in, if I'm kind of thinking, whatever it is, it allows it, I think, unconsciously allows the listener to trust and feel more comfortable with me because they can read more of me. I'm giving them more data, more input. So they feel like they understand what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, instead of making them guess. I'm taking away that awkwardness for them of the, well, I can't read her. I can't see her body language. I don't know what she's thinking or feeling. So by just giving people a little bit more visual, not being the, win the Academy Award, don't look like one, that it's a way to help connect with other people, and it's just more visually stimulating, so it's something else to look at. Think about it this way: would you rather stare at a picture for 5 minutes and listen to the description, or would you rather watch a movie for 5 minutes about this with the same soundtrack about it? Usually most people are going to lose their focus on the visual. They may be listening, but they're going to be looking elsewhere after they feel like they've seen enough for their own satisfaction, to whatever degree that may be.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And, you talked about that some of this is very contextual depending on the where you're doing it, who you're doing it to, et cetera. Right. But it's a skill. I mean, so
Yes.
yes, sometimes the use of body language is more an advanced skill. And I want to be really sensitive to the fact that there are people who get extremely nervous presenting. I mean, if we're talking about a more formal type of situation, even if it's to 3 people,
Sure.
or a boardroom of 20 or whatever, there are people who get genuinely nervous about presenting in front of other people. But I know Dr. Laura, you'll agree with this one. Communication, whether we're talking presentation, whatever, it's a skill, and it takes work and practice, just like anything else.
Yes.
There's a colleague here in Indianapolis I was talking to the other day. She also is kind of in our realm. She teaches communication as well, from a slightly different perspective. But she said that she likens it to abs. She's like, yeah, I want abs, but the fact that I had them one time when I was 21, it doesn't mean that I get to go, all right, I'm all good. Like, I have my abs, I'm set, right? Like, no,
Right.
I have to still engage in the healthy eating and the working out every single day if I want to keep those abs, and communication is no different. So, if you want to get better at using your body language appropriately, if you want to get better at using inquiry as a tool to, connect better with other people, if you want to get better at analogies, all of these things are things that you just have to practice more often.
Yes, yes. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap this up. So the 3 major brain science tips that we talked about today, we're using analogies, which do things like tapping into prior knowledge, otherwise known as scaffolding. We talked about the inquiry skill, asking more questions, creating that curiosity vortex. I love that phrase. And creating that enriched environment with multiple kinds of stimuli: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and a variety within each one. But most importantly, wrapping up with the idea that this is a skill set. It's not a singular skill. It is a constantly evolving skill set, and one that we always have to continue to work on to keep ourselves at the top of our game. I mean, I don't know about you, Dr. Ali, but yes, I am. By the end of the day, I am so sick of seeing my own face on video. I am really ready to turn the camera off. But for as often as I'm on video, I will go back and watch parts of this later on, because I just want to see how I navigated certain things. Was there a difference between what I thought I said and how it actually came across
Yeah.
on video? Even though I'm here while I'm saying it and I'm watching myself talk on video, but nevertheless watching it later objectively, as in third party mode, like I'm watching someone else talk, you just see and hear things that are different from what you perceive in the moment, when you're
Absolutely.
really concentrating on what am I saying and how do I find the right words to get it out now. So I highly recommend to everybody, if these are skills you're really looking for to improve, video record yourself, whether it's a rehearsal or in the moment. You could be Zooming with somebody and you just take your phone and prop it up against you. You set up your thing and prop it over there and just video record yourself on your own Zoom call. You don't have to listen to anybody else's. You're not going to share it with anybody. 2 minutes here, 1 minute there. Just see, am I projecting what I intend? And where's there a gap? And did I use analogies? Did I use any good inquiry skills? Did I create that curiosity vortex? Did I create an enriched environment and give multimodal input and stimuli? All of these are questions you can go back and see, did I do that effectively? The video is your best friend with no filter. It'll tell you exactly what you did and didn't do, and that's great data for your brain.
That's a great
Any
suggestion.
final thoughts, Dr. Ali?
I hope that, people found our conversation today valuable. To me, it's just, I guess I get very heartened by the fact that this is so achievable, when I think sometimes people feel like it's just a black box, and it's really not. So really, really simple ways to just connect with other people and get back to just finding the human in each other and really connecting with each other. That's what this is all about.
Absolutely. How can people learn more about you, Dr. Ali?
Oh, thank you for asking. Definitely, they can go to my website, which is roi-communications.com. Sign up for, if you sign up to be on my newsletter, you'll get a great little resource to learn a little bit more, another tip about the brain. And then they can also find me on LinkedIn, just Ali Atkison, Atkison.
And of course, you can see her name there. And if you are reaching out to either one of us, we certainly both invite you, if we're not already connected on LinkedIn, do connect and let us know that you tuned in to hear all or part of this conversation today. Because I don't know about you, often I won't necessarily accept a connection request with someone who I don't know. I want to know who they are, what brings you to us. And I would definitely love to know that you were here today and what resonated with you. So let us know. Share. The link will be available very shortly for those who would want to watch part of the replay later on. Share it with your friends, and thank you for tuning in today. Dr. Ali, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Dr. Laura. Thank you, everybody.